and just as I mentioned on Friday when we were talking about the industrial chapter, we are increasing the discretion under these transport assessments from what was under the current plan. So under the current plan, we only had to consider really the way the access was designed. We couldn't actually put really consider whether the development was on of an appropriate scale to fit in with the transport corridor. So we've now got more assessment to consider that. So we should be able to have more ability if we choose to be able to assess whether the development is of a sufficient size or appropriate size for the corridor and whether that needs to be changed. So we're hoping through the district plan review we will have more teeth in that regard. So in terms of the integrated transport assessments, we've had some more consultation with the landowners and with transport consultants, and we're working quite closely with them to ensure that the assessments and the requirements for the assessments are workable and fit with their needs, but also give council enough teeth, as I mentioned before, to be able to get the outcomes that we want. One thing that we are looking at making it quite clear in the plan is there was a concern by some landowners that every time they did an extension to a development, they would have to go through another transport assessment process. So for a shopping mall, for example, if they added an additional shop in, they'd have to go through a consent process that looked at the traffic effects every time they added an additional shop. So what we've made it quite clear is that if a landowner, a developer decides that they wants to avoid having to go through a consent process every time they put additional shop in, what they can do is they can apply for a integrated transport assessment for their entire site and for all the future development that they're anticipating, and that will cover all the stages of the development, so they don't have to go through a single consent process every time they introduce a new shop. And what we're hoping is if that will encourage a lot more of the sort of comprehensive look at what a future site or a future extension to a site may look at, so we can look at more comprehensively sort of the wider effects rather than just looking at each shop individually and it just sort of builds up and suddenly the effects are much bigger than what we anticipated. So hopefully we can look at things at a much larger scale and be able to assess the appropriateness at that stage. So that's the change we're looking at making.
Thanks, David. Any questions on those ITAs? Pauline?
Except that they don't have to do it that way, do they? They could still do it the other way.
They can still do it the other way. That's right. It's just an option.
But I think it comes back to what Yanni's saying, that if they do it piece by piece, how do we get that whole concept when we realise it's reached a trigger point where it's going to adversely affect our transport system? Because I know what happens and we end up picking up the tab, don't we, putting in lights, and yeah, I think it's a big concern.
So we'll we have got transport models that look at the anticipated growth of the city for the next 30 years, and so we can feed that into and we do that at the moment, feed that into these transport assessments. So it won't just look at the individual site; it'll also look at what's anticipated, the growth that's anticipated around the site. Obviously, there's a whole lot of assumptions that have to be made about what will happen over the next 30 years, but it's our best guess. And so through these assessments, by increasing the amount of discretion, we can look at these wider effects at the same time. So thanks,
David. Can I just comment? Our environmental committee this morning had a presentation from CTOP, which showed us the technology which can be used, and clearly it's got great potential. Yanni.
So in terms of doing those integrated assessments, do you have the power to say you should provide X amount of space for public transport and X amount for roading and X amount for active transport?
Yeah, so we have got assessment matters around those matters about how much they provide for public transport and for cycling and cars. So and there's obviously also parking requirements and cycle parking requirements as well. So yes, we have got discretion around that. and it'll be up to obviously the commissioner, if it's the commissioner who makes the decision on the consent, or the hearings panel, as to what conditions they put in place and how much space they give to those different modes. But we've definitely got discretion to have a look at it.
Do you think we'll get better outcomes around the bigger developments with this approach? So things like, if you think of some of the dimensions of car parks, think of the lack of safe crossings for people, the lack of public transport facilities, lack of cycling facilities. You think these will make a difference?
Yeah, we've definitely got more discretion to look at that. It will obviously be up to the decision maker, as to whoever it is on each consent, as to how much they apply that discretion. But we've definitely got given the ability to do that.
So where we're at the moment is that we have these traffic impact assessments, and they basically focus on the private motor vehicle. And the whole thing about integrated and thinking about what that means is we look at all modes. And so we look at the cycling, we look at the pedestrians, we look at PT, and we look at the private vehicles. So that's the benefit to them. And there's a whole raft of things that people need to consider as part of that process. So yes, we certainly do have the ability to get far more directive in terms of ensuring that we provide for PEDs, PT, and everything else.
In terms of conditions. And the final question I had on this was, so you get a development, you put into place a traffic assessment, which I presume becomes part of the consent when it's done. Yep. So there's a traffic plan. At what stage do you do a safety audit? Like who's responsible for looking at the safety of it and auditing it and ensuring that it actually makes sense? I'm just thinking, like, how do we avoid the noble subdivision issue again? If we can, we need to learn from that.
Yeah, sure.
So what kind of safeguard can we have?
So we're looking at, the policies and the assessment matters also require that what's being proposed is safe, and so that will be part of the consideration when these assessments come in. It'll depend on the scale of it, as of whether it's appropriate to do a full safety audit on the development, but that is part of the consideration. And we've also got infrastructure design standards which require that developments are safe as well. And so, as well as complying with the district plan, the developments need to also comply with the infrastructure design standards, for which have the specific sort of details as to how wide things are and so forth. From what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think if council is going to take over that infrastructure, so if it's a new road, for example, then council has the ability to refuse to take over that road.
Council has to act in compliance with the resource consent that the council has issued. So if the council has issued a resource consent that says the roads and the infrastructure shall be built to a particular standard, it would not be wise for the council to then say, well, no, we're not going to accept that infrastructure that does comply with those consent conditions. So the... Yeah, that's what I just said, Councillor. So if the resource consent has been issued, after there having been expert opinion evidence that satisfied the council as consent authority that infrastructure was appropriate, built to those standards, you then have a resource consent, and the council gives effect to that resource consent.
So in effect, that becomes a requirement of the plan, Yanni. Well, I understood from what Brent said that the plan, we are saying that. But, well,
They can certainly minimum design standards.
So the infrastructure design standard is made under the Local Government Act, and it was adopted by the council in 2010 or thereabouts. At the moment, the provisions of the district plan haven't caught up with the infrastructure design standard. partly because of the earthquake happening in between. It was always intended that the provisions in the infrastructure design standards that were adopted by the council under the LGA in 2010 would make their way in some sort of way into the district plan. Even if they do make their way in some sort of way into the district plan, people are still entitled to apply for resource consent and get departure from the rules or the requirements in the plan. If the council, as consent authority under the RMA, decides that it's appropriate to do so.
So in effect, that leaves that area open to appeal.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, Yanni?
I know what the current thing is. What I'm saying is I think we should have more weight in our plan to stop that from happening where possible. It creates all sorts
So
of
I guess the
problems.
question then is there a way of nailing this down further within the plan?
As far as the drafting has gone so far, do the provisions in there mirror what's in the infrastructure design
Yes.
standards?
So the specific issue with the noble subdivision was around road widths, and they are contained within the subdivision chapter, and so I think that's coming to you either I think later this afternoon.
Yes, it is.
And so we have mirrored what's in the IDS with what's in the with the draft subdivision chapter. So the issue with Noble is that, as Brent said, the district plan hadn't caught up. The district plan was written in 1995 and the IDS was written in 2010, and it just hadn't caught up in time. But obviously through this review we're trying to catch it up. And so hopefully there won't be that issue where one's inconsistent with the other, which is where Noble sort of fell through the cracks. But as Brent said, we can't limit people's right to lodge a consent to put an argument that they think such and such is safe, and it's so there's no way legally we can avoid that. Yep.
And there's more in that on the subdivision chapter, perhaps. Okay. So, where are we up to now?
Okay, so just jump back to university parking,
Yes.
which is the fourth one down. So we've had further comments from the university around the parking rate, which is on page 24 of the draft chapter. We've had some time to be able to do some more research into that, and so we've amended the parking requirement for the university for tertiary education and research activities, it's called, and actually aligned it with what we had in the current city plan, because further research has shown that actually what we were proposing previously would have required a lot more car parks than what they have at the moment, which was going to be far too onerous for what the university require. And so the university are looking at undertaking a travel plan at the moment to try and encourage more people to cycle and use public transport to reach university, and the Island Road cycle lanes are part of that. So we've changed the parking requirement back to what we had previously to be more realistic. Great. And
So what was the basis for having an increased number, and what was that number?
it was based on looking at some situations in overseas, and we hadn't actually ground truthed the research in New Zealand because it didn't have the time, and so now we've been able to ground truth it and realise that actually no, what we're requiring is far too.
So I'm not the local councillor for that area, but I did go to university once many years ago, and I do go through that area quite frequently.
Yes.
And on just about every street around the university, there's signs up restricting car parking to 2 hours.
Yes.
Because there's not sufficient car parking provided at the university. So those residents are having to pick up the cost of the shortage of parking. So why would we be going back to a known problem?
Because the university at the moment haven't, because most of it was built in the 1960s and 70s, when the parking regulations were quite different. 70s, yeah. The new development that they're proposing will require more car parks than what they currently have. So the new development will increase the number of car parks we've got on site. What was previously proposed was about a threefold increase in the amount of car parks, and it was just far too much. So we are quite confident with the research that they've shown that this will provide enough car parks for what they require. But what we can't stop through the district plan, because the district plan is only one tool to deal with parking, and then this is an issue across the whole city. The district plan won't automatically solve all our parking issues. One of the issues for the university, and it's an issue for a number of other sites around the city, is that if a development charges for parking or puts in restrictions on who can use those parks, so it's time limits, and there are free parks on the road outside the development. Obviously, people are going to park where it's free rather than having to pay on the premises. And there's nothing we can do to stop a landowner charging for parking. It's their economic right to make money off their land. So that's just something that we continually have to battle with, and that's why in some cases we have to put in time restrictions, and we may have to in the future look at charging for on-street parking, because we're going to have to compete with the fact that the landowner is charging for parking. So that's just the reality. The district plan is not going to solve all the parking issues. It's going to help, hopefully, by requiring more parking, but there are other tools we're going to have to look at, and time restrictions are just a reality, unfortunately. Because
so wouldn't the argument of making them required to provide more parking work against the idea that people would go and park on the street because it was free? Because surely if they were having to provide more parking, they'd have more of an incentive to use that space wisely, to encourage people to use it. So why?
Well,
I mean, it just seems to me like I'd be really interested in getting some more information around this, understanding what your projections are for the car parking numbers at university, what local assessments you've done, if any, with the local community board, because I have to say I am quite concerned about this.
Can I comment too, Yanni, that my understanding is that the ECAN's proposed bus routes, that they cater for this area and currently are doing very well in terms of patronage. So I guess that would be part of what the information we might get too, but it just seems to be quite a complex area to resolve. I'm not sure if the staff are... Ref?
So you've got 20 spaces here per 100 FTEs at the uni. How many was that before?
So that's the same as what it was before.
But it's always been that way.
Well, it was like that in obviously the previous city plan that was written in 1995. Prior to that, it was under the Waimaori District Council, County Council, from what I understand, which would have had a probably different requirement.
I mean, so you've only really got 20% of students driving to uni, is what you're saying.
Well, shared vehicles as well,
Yeah.
and others.
And do you have any
taking
data
other
from
modes.
uni about what that percentage actually is?
Sorry?
Do you have any data from the university? Because I'm sure they have some travel
Yes,
data.
yeah, so they have done travel surveys, and so that's what we've based it on, which is about right. Of course, people don't turn up to uni at the same time with different lectures and different so whilst there's 20 spaces per 100 students, obviously with carpooling and with people having different lectures, it does cater for the number of people driving. We are also obviously looking at, we've got major cycleway going, well, we've already built part of it on Island Road. We're obviously trying to encourage people to cycle to the university, with the one from the city to the university as well. Obviously, ECAN investing in the bus route. So there are a lot of travel options to the university, and so that reflects the choice that people have.
Yeah, but people do end up parking all around Rickerton Bush, all the way down there, and then sort of walking into uni.
I think realistically it'd be difficult to provide for all the parking on site, because the university would end up being a car park and not much else.
Yeah. Well, they've got a car park there. They could easily build a proper car park in there.
Yeah, and that raises cost issues with them. But the feedback we've had from the university is this is a realistic, that their surveys show that 20 spaces per 100 FTEs is about right. So I think the provisions that David's put in there reflects the surveys that they have done. But I think for that site and with those number of students, it'd be very difficult to cater for it all on site. I mean, you'd put
Well,
Two or three
I'd say you
car
build a
parking
parking
buildings.
building, but I mean, having been there myself several times, I can assure you trying to get a car park in there is
Yeah.
next to impossible. So I think from the university's perspective, they should be looking at building a proper 2 or 3 story car park.
Yeah, I'd tend to agree with this. In fact, the parking issues stretch right down through to Hamilton Ave, Memorial Ave.
Hamilton
They
Ave, yeah.
park that far out to go to university, so it is obviously a major problem. And to get that far out shows you the capacity of the roads and the road restrictions. They move just further away, so you can't just road restrict everything. to
And the
solve
uni has
problem.
actually put up parking fees, but I mean, that doesn't put people off because a lot of people actually, that is their only way to get there.
Okay, so the changes are in orange, but
Yes.
councillors overall agreeing with that? There seems to be some debate around it. Or are you asking for it to be changed? It just seems to me too, can I just add though, that student parking is sort of like, needs to be part of the city's strategic transport plan too. And there is a desire, we've referred before to active transport, and that needs to be taken into account. So some of the students are walking a fair distance. But basically, are councillors wanting, prepared to leave this as it is?
Can I
or
just
you
make
want it
another
to be
point as
changed?
well, is that 25% of students these days are mature students. So you have the idea that all students are young and they're all flatting and they can bike or bus or walk into uni, but actually 25% are mature students. So they may be coming from all over the place. They may be coming from jobs or workplaces or whatever. So it's not as straightforward a population as it probably used to be.
Yep.
Can I just clarify though, councillors accepting of how it is, given there are some difficulties with this, but the changes that have been made, are we okay with that? Well, what do you want it to be changed to?
Could I say
Get further
that,
information
we-
back.
I'll hear from
can't-
Brigitte, then
sorry, we
yourself,
can't
Yanni.
just change a figure based on anecdotal evidence. And what David has told us to date is based on the evidence that he has from a number of different locations, this is the figure that's coming up.
What I want to do is really get an understanding of the assumptions and the information around what's currently happening, what was happening at the time of the earthquake or, before, and what the new changes would do versus what the changes we initially had in. Yeah, I mean, I think if you're saying you've done further work and you've got further information behind it, then we should be able to see and understand what that means.
Yes, absolutely, we can bring that back for you.
Sorry, officers, is that information in the Section 32 report?
No, not that much detail. But
You'll bring what you have available.
We'll bring that back potentially tomorrow, if there's spare time. I think there might be after the
Okay.
natural hazards chapter.
Thank you. So are we now looking at disabilities, life mark parking?